and my girl's birthday month.
What's this kid September?
Right after me. Yes, sir. Right after me, and we live, baby. Gilded Sages, we are here again with another broadcast. I am Devon Lassine, TheeBlackAngloSaxon. I am here with my housemates, InquisitiveQ, Quentin Horton, and behind the camera, we got my man Quan the Poet, Daquan Johnson, and we are here again live with another conversation. Make sure you get your phone docked, bro, so you can get everything you need for the technologicals and all of those good things. But while we doing that, in the first part of the broadcast, what we are going to do is, can everybody please, if you are watching, can you like the video? Can you comment? If you here with me, man, just comment and leave a, we appreciate y'all, because just, as a preface, it's a lot of conversations around, the terrible black men. The terrible black men, we'll have a conversation about that. But tonight, we want to uplift. What we want is the cream of the crop. We need that to basically push out. And if you want to turn that into a community action, we need you undoubtedly in terms of having this conversation, elevating this conversation, so that we can hold all and everybody accountable, including myself.
I definitely include me.
And my housemates.
I need to be held accountable.
And my housemates.
You know what being held accountable is like? It's like having a chaperone.
It's
like having a chaperone. You're being irresponsible and you don't want to listen to that part in your head. That's what a person holding you accountable is. Like,
you know what's funny? The chaperone, for like a year, Con couldn't go on the trip without us being a chaperone, just because he was not even a bad kid, but he was the energetic, wandering kid. Like, I'm about to go over here. So he's like, hey, Slim, look, if y'all don't come on a trip,
he can't come.
He a no-go. But again, appreciate y'all. Love my team. Love everybody who tuning in, join in, give y'all some time to fill in. But today, we're going to just jump right into it. The conversation is the origin story of America. Slavery built America. So,
go ahead.
In terms of the conversation that we're having today, I want to preface it with, one, understanding that this is not a conversation about reparations. This is not a conversation about what is owed. And I say that because some of the context that I have used to bring us in this conversation is centered and anchored in around that. And I also want to speak to the fact that any of our, immigrant brothers, Black immigrants, Latino, white, Irish, white ethnics, who understand where we are coming from on this day and the conversation that we are having. I want you to come to this conversation in good faith, but I also want to have this conversation as I've heard this notion and I've heard this phrase be used again and again in terms of immigrants built America. So I want to have and frame the conversation around us having a dialogue around what is the history around America and its inception, and how we have come to be a nation of immigrants, which I don't necessarily disagree with at this point in time, given the demographic influx. So I want to give that as a disclaimer on the front end, because this is not I am against immigrants or we are against immigrants.
Not xenophobic. It is a conversation on labor, but we're not xenophobic.
Not at all. And even in not being xenophobic, I want people to understand that rule number one is, if it don't apply, let it fly. Because I understand that we have allies. I've reached out to a couple people who couldn't participate with me today who are of Nigerian descent. We have, again, my housemate here who will be, speaking to some of the conversation around other Black immigrant groups, but I did do my due diligence. And if you have that link, Quan, you could drop it in the chat for later, and we can repost that because I do want to allow the voice of immigrants, because I do feel like it's necessary to have that dialogue and have it. And again, you don't necessarily have to be in lockstep with what we are saying.
That's boring.
I just want you to come to the conversation in good faith.
That's necessary.
And so that we can have a dialogue about how this quote unquote American institution has used all of us, not just African American bodies, but how they use immigrant bodies, whether those bodies are white ethnics in terms of the Irish, Scottish, Jews, and so on and so forth, or whether those be Nigerians, Ghanaians, Latinos, and Black immigrants, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to preface that, because I know this is a very, very touchy conversation. And, you know, I have friends and I have allies and I have people that I have moved with and had conversations with in private. And if you're watching this, you feel free to chime in and call in, as it helps me, you know, in terms of having this conversation. But I want to jump into it with the first article. But before I get into the first article, I want to touch my partner, InquisitiveQ, in terms of just his thoughts on the conversation and America as a whole, in terms of how they not only use us as African Americans, but how they have been able to use immigrants in their labor to undermine that conversation. Before I jump into what is the first article.
Okay. So I like how you teed it up. Thank you. Because the first white paper that we're going to deliver, the white papers is we're going to see is our gray literature for colored minds. And what we mean by that is that the hashtag is me playing on the African American vernacular, English, and how we use the word to be in a singular most of the time. You is instead of you are. But I is basically internal intellectual soliloquies. And in the first white paper, I talk about how Montesquieu talks about retaliation or the spirit of the law, where I reference it. But it really gets into the ongoing punitive discussion of Black American men, because it has to be. And when we talk about the America and the labor it was used for Black Americans, to start on Black Americans, you have to see how, one, sexism played into it, and you also have to see how the labor of Black American men was used over the top of the intellectual capabilities of Black American men, and how that has stifled the political education of Black American men to understand what's at risk within the family structure. Therefore, certain things are necessary. But how I ground that? Because one of the things about talking about America is that we have to be mindful of our regionalisms. So I like to ground myself, and I had grounded the article in Alexis de Tocqueville's On Democracy in America. And Alexis de Tocqueville will be an ongoing thing, because he talks about the township, he talks about the penal system, he talks about the American psychology as well. And so it will be very interesting to see how Jay-Z making money from the inner city is having that influence is akin to Benjamin Franklin being on a $100 bill, although he was never president. And so what I'm making the argument for, I believe, is that America is a place within its narrative, within its ethos, focuses on the hustle. America's favorite child is the hustler. And with racism and sexism, you get a disqualification of who can be a hustler. And so when you get into the immigrant narrative highlights another part of America, our diasporic narratives. So if we're all immigrants, then we all are from a diaspora. And that's when we get into the Black American diaspora or the Black diaspora, and we get, and how colonialism, which we'll see later on, played an effect where black immigrants didn't come into the 1960s, but we'll talk about that later. I just wanted to end on a point of labor in America is not talked about often in the open because it's cloaked underneath this veil of meritocracy.
Mm-hmm.
And because you have the veil of meritocracy, people are willing to take on a narrative of I am not capable versus a narrative of the system is failing me. And that's when you get to the finger pointing amongst the black POCs, non-black POCs, the black Muslims, the non-black Muslims, the black Christians, the non-black Christians, and then all the other black, white, the color line, the Negro problem that you get into when we start to introduce non-black people into the discussion about labor in America.
Cool. So, first up, we have article here. We are now sharing the screen, and this is the Atlantic Slavery Made in America. This is from Ta-Nehisi Coates. I know this is some of you guys, one of you guys' faves. But what we're going to get into, though, is what he talks about in terms of the origin story and bringing it back to slavery is what built America, and slavery and African Americans are the group that is used to undermine all other groups. And before I get into the quote and what he talks about, I need for everybody to understand in the room is when we're talking about labor and we're talking about wealth classification in America in 2020, soon to be 2021, and we talk about the game, quote unquote, planet, what we have to understand is that model is built on this model that we're about to address today. And what I want to keep in the frame of mind to help any allies that we do have in the building really reconcile and understand how they are being used so that they can then actually push back effectively on quote unquote white supremacy. But I also need you to understand that how co-opting our narrative as African Americans is detrimental not only to us as a group, but detrimental to yourselves as a group, as it does not correct the initial sin origin story of America.
The old corruption.
The oldest corruption. And so that's Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? And so the quote starts off, by 1860, there were more millionaires, slaveholders, all in quotes, living in the lower Mississippi Valley than anywhere else in the United States. In the same year, the nearly 4 million American slaves were worth some 3.5 billion, making them the largest financial asset in the entire U.S. economy, worth more than all manufacturing and railroads combined. So, of course, the war was rooted in these two expanding and competing economies. But competing over what, though, is the question. What eventually tore asunder America's political culture was slavery's expansion into Western territories. And so I'm going to stop sharing there, and we're going to get into the first part of the conversation. And I want to get into what he spoke to in terms of the expansion of the quote unquote Western territories. Because we can talk about America in its singular form, but not only did slavery and the body of African Americans and the free labor and exploitation of that labor provide wealth, expedited wealth of America. It also provided expedited wealth, well, not expedited wealth, extra on top of wealth for European nations, other colonies that were existing in Africa as they went on their conquest. And so we had this moment in time now where, again, we're having this conversation because time and time and time and time again, I hear people say immigrants have built America. We have a Democratic National Convention where we have not only one, but two, but three people, Obama, Kamala, and Biden, speak to immigrants building America. Joe Biden being a quote unquote Irish, if I believe Kamala being Asian American, if I believe, then Obama himself being Kenyan American. With that being said, I'm trying to figure out and understand how immigrants built America and if we are, as a nation, in such a way willing to undermine what was the transatlantic slave trade to America and what slavery meant in America. Because my biggest pushback is we aren't immigrants. You and I are not immigrants as our ancestry.
We never had a visa.
We never had a choice.
We didn't have a visa.
And we can't go anywhere. We can't go back to anywhere. We don't have embassies, and we don't have the backing of other nations, which we'll get into in the later part of the broadcast about how, whether it be Japanese Americans and all of these other different types of immigrants who have integrated into American society without the same penal code. But I just want to hear your thoughts in terms of how you view this reshaping of the narrative that immigrants built America when we're interfacing with literature, whether it be scholarly, whether it be articles, or whether however you consume, whether it be the university, JSTOR, or whatever. How do you feel about the comments that were made in terms of immigrants building America, along with your stances, and not only your stances, but your insight into what built America?
That's funny. I stopped laughing because it's like that narrative and headline is so easy to call out because it's like, yeah, immigrants built America, right? Immigrants from Europe built America, and that's a problem that we have with America. But that's not what we're here for. My insight into this is that when we start talking about wealth, anachronisms, or people who take the lens of the contemporary to judge the past, and that's when we get into the problem, right? Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that when you look at past attitudes towards Black bodies and African bodies, you get a pattern of, well, they're all the same. They don't matter. There's like the Greeks going Baba, meaning they don't speak Greek, so they're barbarians. And so what I'm getting to is that if you don't take in consideration the art, in this case, Sambo art, that talks about how Black Americans, men and women, were depicted in popular images in America and in Europe. Because we have to understand that when we talk about Anglo-Saxon capitalism, they didn't start the first trade with Black African bodies. The Portuguese started in the 15th century when you have Henry the Navigator getting the people bull to go around the Saharan trade. That's Hugh Thomas, slavery, the transatlantic slave trade. What I'm getting to is that the slave trade is not new. We have slave codes that go back to 1260. That's before you get into the Virginia with the 17th century and the 1600s. Mm-hmm. What I'm getting to is that by the time you get to Anglo-American capitalism, you have an advanced system that is dealt with, that has distribution, it has distribution bodies, it has storage of bodies. It's a system. It's a system. It's a trade system. and getting down to the labor, people are trading in labor. But the initial players, when we get down to talking about the tribes, because again, when we start talking about immigrants from the continent of Africa, we have to start getting into how people who are Nigerian come in my head for calling them Nigerian, because like we talking about self-determination. It's over 400 languages. We shouldn't be called Nigerians. But that gets into the Berlin Conference of 18 whatever. My whole point is that if you go to Alfred Chandler Jr., no, not there, but Alfred, we don't have to bring that up on the screen. For those who are interested, Alfred Chandler Jr., The Visible Hand, a managerial relationship in American business, is a nice supplemental to what Coates is talking about and what you're talking about. The origin story of America is that when you had the Jay Treaty, we still had to trade with Great Britain. We had to trade with Great Britain because you got to afford your revolution.
Yeah.
You got to pay for your revolution. So one of the things that happened with the following of the Articles of Confederation is that you get elimination from Thomas Jefferson talking about how slavery is an abomination. Thomas Jefferson talks about it, but it's in the first draft. Why? Because the same reason we had the Civil War. The South was focused on building its reputation. And that's one of the main things that we don't address in America when we talk about the Black American is how the North and South, even outside of Black America, views itself differently. America is a place what I love about Leslie de Tocqueville, in the time in which he was writing, he was talking about America being countries, different countries, drawn under one union. And if we started to see ourselves more like the European Union, as in each state has its own identity, which is in our Constitution, and then those identity comes to the federal level, we will see how the southern states made sure that they kept their rhetoric of Black people being inferior in place to justify the planter class using Black labor while also saying that they're free from King George III. Basically what I'm saying is that once you accept Sambo art and you accept that America is fractured by its regions, you will also begin to accept the lost cause myth is a myth that upholds a very white supremacist racial idea that Black people and Black bodies are dependent upon white minds. Meaning that if white people don't tell what the Black person to do, then they don't know what to do for themselves. And that's where a lot of times I see amongst immigrant groups, they repeat that narrative. And that's where it becomes troublesome for me.
And to piggyback on that, I think for the most part, when we talk about immigrants building America, and I want to make the affirmative that I do understand that there were immigrants in the nation, or quote unquote colonies, or however you want to identify, in America, right? During the Gilded Age, which we'll get into later when we talk about the 1870s up into the 1870s up into the 1900s, and we see that what I'll call soft immigration, where we have mainly white ethnic immigrants when we talk about that. So a lot of the pushback that I get in terms of the conversation is, well, we've been here, we've been doing this as long as you all have been in terms of African Americans. But what I would say is, when you look at the spectrum of quote unquote immigrants, we have to look in and file in that, okay, when you talk about Jewish people immigrating to America, I understand the Jews were discriminated against. But what we don't ever address, or when we talk about the Irish having their time in America as being a quote unquote Negro. But I think my issue comes in where we don't ever have the conversation of how those people chose willingly to side with the quote unquote, like you were saying earlier, about appealing to that white standard. And I don't think we have a conversation enough. And even when you talk about Asian Americans, whether that be South Asian, Japanese, and so on and so forth. I don't think we have enough conversation about how those people were able to matriculate within America, because you could argue, quote unquote, your whiteness in the court of law. You could argue that. So if I was light enough to pass, I could argue my whiteness in the court of law. I don't think we touch on enough that, yeah, you may have been an immigrant and you all want to take this immigrant stance now in the 2020 when it's real powerful, but the way that you have compiled and compounded on top of anti-African American
or anti-blackness,
because when we talk about blackness over here in the gilded area, we're talking about blackness in its inception. In its inception of
its application.
And how it was applied to, again, create race in America, cause that divide, and be able to allow people to come in and argue which narrative they were going to move with, which narrative they were going to live with, and how they were going to navigate America. Some of us, a person like yourself, being brown skinned, doesn't necessarily have that benefit. And bringing it back up to 2020 for a second, and the whole Trump and doing the bans on Nigeria and all of these other quote unquote brown nations, as people will call them, those nations did not have access to America when we talk about the Gilded Ages, when we talk about the 1870s up into the 1900s. You had to be able to pass or be in a proximity to be able to even argue it.
So you had to be, so what you're saying is that you had to be white. When you say pass, you had to be white. Because there was a non-white category. So that's one thing I want to clarify, because I want to go over the whole thing.
Yeah, because what happens is even if you're brown and you come to America, if you have that ambiguity, you can argue, and like we always talk about, adapt your behaviors to mirror and compound on. Exactly.
Okay. Let me know when you're done so I can jump in.
And so, like, with that being said, it's like the narrative of quote unquote immigrants building America is true in a very, very small nugget. Because what happens is we also know that whether it be Native Americans, Jews, not Asian Americans, because I don't think they participated in slavery on this land. But Native Americans, Jews have all participated in slavery, chattel slavery in the Americas. You made a willingness to, again, build your communal wealth on the back of that. But with that being said, in 2020, you come back now and say that we also built America. And so my thing, or my question is, did you capitulate to the whiteness that you're critiquing now? Or did you build it also on the backs of slaves like
I get you.
Everybody else?
This is where Black Americans have to learn how to be an ally. And this argument about Black liberation, right? Black Americans do not like to be an ally. And what I mean by that is that there are Asian Americans, Far East Asian Americans, as well as South Asian Americans, who argue against the model minority. They understand that they're being implicated in white supremacy by saying we're not the model minority, but those voices are not heard. You have the anti-blackness. We know that anti-racist is going around now, and that's a popular term, but you also have the anti-blackness. And what I mean by being a Black ally, I don't mean go out and protest for everybody and be in everyone's interest. What I mean about being a Black ally, a Black American ally, is consume the narratives about other people that you want consumed about you. So that when we come and have these discussions, they are more sophisticated. Because like one of the things that when you start talking about the Jewish diaspora is that even within the Jewish diaspora, an Austrian Jew is not the same as a Polish Jew. The same thing about a Jew in Germany is not the same as a Jew in Israel. So when you say someone is Jewish, we have to understand, one, that's just a history that person, individual has inherited. It's the same thing when we say about white America, because when we go down to the Gilded Sages and we talk about the white ethnic groups, when you look at Thomas Nast, Thomas, spell usual spelling, Nast, N-A-S-T, you'll see how the Irish were depicted. And you have this tagline, the melting pot of Europe. Mm-hmm. The melting pot of Europe. And everyone likes to say, oh, you're a great big melting pot. Because what I'm hearing is, from you is that, and correct me if I'm wrong before I continue, is that I'm hearing that you would like for this tagline, Immigrants Built America, to come with at least a subtitle of, because I'm thinking of colons right now, the subtitle of Along the Slaves, or on the backs of slaves. Or with the acknowledgement of slaves. It's like Immigrants Built America, COVID, let's acknowledge the slaves. And to which that, you have to agree.
Because when you do in that blanket statement, and not to cut you off,
when
you do it in that blanket statement, technically the European settlers were immigrants.
That's what I was getting to. And that's where I'm going. It's like, if you say that, then when you have a subversive asshole like me who just think, okay, that's funny, you're playing with words. Yes, immigrants built America. But that's also white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And because when we get into talking about the 400 years of poor white trash, Nancy, I cannot pronounce her last name, the poor white trash.
Pelosi?
No, not Nancy Pelosi. I'm not talking about politicians. I'm talking about I don't give that much care about politicians. But when we talk about the 400 years of poor white trash, we also have to look at the exploitation of poor white people. More importantly, the case, I forgot, it was in Virginia, is part of IS, in which in the 17th century, we had the first case where we had 3 indentured servants that ran away. 2 were a white man, and 1 was a white man. I'm a black African at this point in time, because we didn't have to turn black. And the 2 that escaped they had more years of servitude added to their indentured servants, but then the black body was told that they were being servants for permanently. So that goes to show that you have this de jure case before you even get into the revolution. It's like slavery and the exploitation of labor is a part of the American narrative, whether you are black or whether you are white. And the problem is that you are siloed in the hood and you are siloed in the holler. What I'm getting down to, what I'm trying to express and explain is that when you say immigrants built America without that subtitle on the blacks and slaves, you miss out, and you don't have to even go to Coates if you don't like Coates. Go to Chandler and see how slaves building
What's the first name for the people?
Alfred Chandler Jr. How Alfred Chandler Jr., a business historian, shows how sophisticated the American economy became because of the volume of cotton that was produced by America and how that fed into the Jay Treaty. So what I'm coming to is like, you don't have to agree with the Black American narrative. You don't have to agree with Black liberation. If you just look at America's labor practices and where it got its labor from, you'll begin to see the value of listening to the Black diaspora in labor discussions, in which what we have to talk about, what the immigrant diaspora talks about, especially with Sin Nombre, is how you have federal policies that affect Latin America and cause Latin Americans to want to come to America because that they're being exploited in their country. So it's not like, oh my God, we got an immigrant problem. They took our jobs. It's more like, y'all didn't give us no money to live, so we had to come in.
We're going to get to that because the Gilded Sages, the Gilded Age, spoke on, American imperialism a little bit. And we'll do a book report on it one of these days.
Gotcha.
But to get into the next, conversation, and before we do, anybody watching, like the video, share, comment, please. We need your comments, man. Look, you don't gotta disagree. I mean, you don't have to agree, disagree. This is about having a robust conversation and actually being able to capture the voice of people who quote unquote typically don't matter. So I can build myself, build the team, build the community, and then take it and talk shit to the people who I want to talk shit to. Because in the end, I'm a political. Go ahead.
I was saying, are we about to segue into another part of the agenda? Before we go there, though, do we have, I'm going to go to Quan, do we have anything interesting?
Man, yes. So I want to shout out a few people. On the Instagram live, we got Ice X96. He's actually a Black British.
Okay.
And one of the things that
what's up, bro?
We've been having a little bit of discord about was I asked the question of is there a difference between being Black British and African American? And he was saying that it's different history. We have a different cultural identity, and we've had so much African American culture imposed on us. And I just had him elaborate on it. And he says, in terms of liberating ourselves from the struggle, it's a disadvantage to them. Powerful. And then
we need our voices. Though.
But he also said, how am I going to heal my pain when you've always focused on my brothers who had it worse? So I looked at that.
So this is what I'll say. I hope the brother is still watching, because that's powerful right now.
Please follow us. Email us. Please.
What happens is, because in America right now, we trying to have this conversation because I want the British Americans, the
British Americans,
for lack of a better word.
Who are the only reason I say that because England loves to believe that England still owns everything.
So Oribo, Boyega,
they're not British Americans. They're British actors who work in America.
But that's the thing. We trying to get them as African Americans to understand the better way to address and help us as well as their brothers over in Europe is that, son, create your own narrative in this space so that we can all have our different stories. Because you playing Harriet Tubman isn't beneficial. Play what it is you come from.
Equiano. So instead of being Frederick Douglass, be Equiano. So and that would help us because, me, I am an Afro-Mod. I am so excited that he brought that in because African Americans don't understand how influential we are. We're going to get into Burna Boy, but it's just like, why does Burna Boy, who's kind of the leader of Afro beats right now, coming in and working with Diddy? Like, Diddy is trash for real as a producer, but we know that it was all about a media play. I listened to the album. We're going to get to the Power World 5. But my thing about, and I kept bringing that up, is that one thing that has to be acknowledged amongst the diaspora that Baldwin did at the Oxford Union. You can never forget that you are American. Because there's some things before you even became aware that you were the enemy, you wanted to be the cowboy.
Yeah.
So I say that to say is that, he's a British Black dude. He's British. He's still English. But that is to say, thank you for that. Do we have anybody else that you want to shout out? To see that YouTube is also popping.
Okay, so on the YouTube, we have Zimba G, who, because I asked the question, do you feel like you were raised differently due to having immigrants within your family? And one of them responded saying, let me pull it up. They said they didn't get to go outside as much due to the fact that there was a difference between
the cultures.
Exactly. So that sort of, gives a little more nuance as far as.
That's back. And we always had that conversation about the different degrees of immersion when it comes to being immersed in urban, quote unquote, Black environments versus those who aren't necessarily. And I think that's a different conversation for a different day when we talk about affluent Blacks versus quote unquote poor Blacks. And the dichotomy of this conversation, full transparency, me and this man are family. In the same family, same matriarch, same grandmother, mothers and sisters. But because of the paths and the different placements that we've been, we are walking, talking billboards of how the socialization of the environment changes. But ironically enough, and this is going to be just for the crew who are here with us right now, because what happens is we get to be honest with each other in terms of this is how you see the world, this is how I see the world, and respect that. And this is what we need from the diaspora more than anything, is that I'm a nigga, right?
Proud of that.
Straight from,
proud of that.
I'm proud of it. Because you wanna know why? You wanna know why?
Badge.
Niggas count you out. And they don't offer you any resources when they don't think you can carry the torch.
Exactly.
But still up until this point, I proved time and time and again that despite not necessarily being quote unquote on the track that people would like a person to be on, I put in the work. And I think that what we have to do is build amongst each other and really come into these conversations in good faith and understand that my brothers in Britain, look, y'all got plights. Oh, sister, I'm sorry, my bad. Even better, right? Y'all got
please
y'all own
email
plights.
us. Let us know what's going on.
GuildedSages@gmail.com.
Please email us. Let us know what's going on.
We got our own plights. I'm coming to these conversations in good faith. I don't necessarily know every single thing, the same way I don't know every single thing in terms of this man's life as well as I. It's about coming to and really building a monolith, because a lot of the times, what you'll hear me say a lot of the times on this show is that quote unquote Black people don't necessarily like being a monolith, and I know we are diverse in that way. But when we talk about white supremacy and we talk about the British Empire that never falls, we need to become a monolith. Because if we are not a monolith, we will be toppled over every single last time. Because here in America, they are savages. They are heathens. And they do not care. And I'm sure you all understand the same. As I just witnessed you all elections with Boris.
I love Boris.
Brexit.
You know when you get Boris in trouble? Sturgis. The S&P. I love it. But let's go into this other thing because we can vibe on this all day.
Boom. You know we can.
Yeah.
So the next coming up, boom, is we got another article from the guy Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I'm welcoming your lambasting because Ta-Nehisi Coates, is an academic. I have my things against academics, but I won't get into it today. But what we are doing right now is I'm having this conversation is I want to put into frame that when we talk about immigrants and we talk about how they are integrated into America, I need people to understand the timing of when you come into America, right? And so this big quote right here, from the 1930s through the 1960s, Black people across the country were largely cut out of legitimate home mortgage market. And the reason that I highlighted that was because I want to touch on, before we get to Hot Seller Act, I want to touch on this timing when Black was synonymous with African American. And that quote unquote trauma was specific to African American. And the reason that I say that is because even if you were a Black immigrant migrating to America, which they had a cap on, which we'll get into, you were thrusted into African American. Black was synonymous with African American. I need people to understand that. When you talk about Stokely Carmichael, when you talk about Shirley Chisholm, and you talk about likening all of these people to all of these leaders that we had pre-1970, we have to understand that these people, in the eyes of the institution of America, when you were Black, you were African American. Now, the nuance in that was that you can get a little bit more if you treated African Americans with a little disparage. But before I let you go on, because I see your mind working over there,
It is.
I'm gonna get into the other quote that I took from this article, right? Because it says the consequence of 250 years, this is the quiet plunder of enslavement, of war upon black families and black people were profound. Like home ownership today, slave ownership was aspirational. Aspirational. Attracting not just those who own slaves, but those who wish to. Much as a homeowner today might discuss the addition of a patio or the painting of a living room, slaveholders traded tips on the best methods for breeding workers, exacting labor, and doling out punishment. And I'll go on. Making of the second ghetto. The efforts began in earnest in 1917, a little bit after the Gilded Ages, right before we get into the Roaring '20s, where America moves into a consumption-based economy. When the Chicago real estate bull, horrified by the influx of Southern blacks, lobbied to zone the entire city by race. Race in America was black and white, no other. Even if you were Latino, you had to choose black or white. And most of them, which we'll get into later, 53% white claimed the identification. But after the Supreme Court ruled against explicit racial zoning that year, the city was forced to pursue its agenda by more discreet means. Like the Homeowners Loans Corporation, the Federal Housing Administration initially insisted on restrictive covenants. And I'll let you speak to that later in terms of the covenants, which help bar blacks and other ethnic undesirables, the Irish at this point, the Asians at this point, but they chose a different route, from receiving federally backed home loans. By the 1940s, Chicago led the nation in the use of restrictive covenants, and about half of all residential neighborhoods in the city were effectively off limits to blacks. More than 98% of all family public housing units built in Chicago between 1950 and the mid 1960s were built in all black neighborhoods. So, this being the last quote. When we think of white supremacy, we picture colored only signs. The early American economy was built on slave labor. The Capitol and the White House were built by slaves. President James K. Polk traded slaves from family structures by pundits and intellectuals, ring hollow in a country whose existence was predicated on the torture of black fathers, on the rape of black mothers, and the sale of black children. An honest assessment of America's relationship to the black family as a whole unit, stop the gender wars, please, reveals the country to be not its nurturer, but its destroyer. Go ahead, Mr. Inquisitive Q.
That's hilarious. I like it. Because when you started talking about the black family structure, the first person that came to my head was Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr., who has done a number of documentaries about the lineage of black people. So you know how I love the Ivory Tower, I call it the Tower of London. But Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr., aka Skip, talks about the 26% European blood that exists in black Americans on average because of the rape and everything else. So when we do, and that's one thing we have to acknowledge in the black diaspora, is like, no, And Bill Withers, the late Bill Withers, acknowledged that our music doesn't sound the same as basically soca or Afro beats. It's different.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point about the timeline and getting into the timeline, that's when we have to start talking about the slave codes and we have to start talking about the immigrants that built America, the white people. I don't play with it. I'm Kanye with the magnet hat. My whole point is that once you begin to understand America not from a black perspective, but from a European perspective, you can see that it was the French and the Germans who helped the British rebels that we call the founding fathers, who we didn't have the first American president until 8 presidents in, but that's another story. But anyway, the French and Germans who helped the British rebels that we call the founding fathers fight King George III as a way to get back to the English Empire. I love how the French and English fight. But to your point about the timeline, I wanted to also talk about Ebony and Ivory, a book about how slaves literally helped build American universities. It's Ebony and Ivory by Craig Stephen Wilder. And what's important about that is that Harvard was once seen as this backward water university. But because of the collective labor and the collective effort that white Americans were able, before we even get to the white creation opportunity of the GI Bill in creating the suburbs, which is just an extension of the Homestead Act, that was another why we journeyed west, and the story about slavery in the West comes in. But what I'm trying to get down to is that with Ebony and Ivory, you begin to see how slave labor helps to finance and franchise white ideals. And what I mean by white ideals, again, I never talk about a complexion. I always talk about ideology. Mm-hmm. I always talk about what people believe in. And so when you see how a person has to commit their labor to someone else's ideas, you begin to see why Black Americans in our culture become defensive about people saying, well, you didn't do this. It's like, oh, wait a minute. I was here when we had Jamestown. I was here and so and so, and I didn't choose to come here. I didn't have a visa. What the American Empire did to you, I wasn't able to participate in, because the American Empire is about wealth, and has always been excluded from wealth. And going back to How to Breed, you brought the damn book for me. I'm talking about Dr. Stephanie Jones Myers. Mm-hmm. Again, Dr. Stephanie Jones Myers. They were her property. And it talks about how white American women, or I should say white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, because when you start talking about the white ethnic groups, you have to acknowledge white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, because there was anti-Catholicism in America, and then the KKK also focused on anti-Jewish people before they became anti-Black, because at the bottom of it, it's a Christian organization. Mm-hmm. But what I'm getting into is that when they were her property by Dr. Stephanie Jones Roger, I believe it's doctor, is that you talk about how white women, even amongst the sexism that existed in the 19th century, how you would have white fathers make sure that their daughters were protected from white men who would basically lie and act like they had money when they didn't. So what I'm getting to is that white don't mean white. When I mean white does not mean all white. Black doesn't mean broke. And so what has happened in the imagination of America is that Black has been seen and associated with poor. And in the American, going back to the hustle, the American imagination is that if you are poor, then that means you don't know how to hustle. And if you don't know how to hustle, there's a problem with you. And if there's a problem with you, that means you're nefarious. And that goes into a Puritan way of seeing America. And with America, we have to begin to talk about our narratives instead of talking about people, because people come from narratives. Mm-hmm. As much as we like to say we change narratives, people come from narratives. And when we talk about the 1960s and we talk about the Black immigration groups, we still have to talk about post-colonialism. Let's get rid of intersectionality. Let's get rid of the postmodernists who have never read the great book, so you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. I'm gonna say it again slower. Let's get rid of the postmodernists who have never read the great books, so you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. You don't know. You haven't read. It takes work to get here. The same way he works out, I work my mind. You have to comprehend what you're talking about, because once you get there, you don't understand the history in which white Americans have suffered for suffrage. When I say the British rebels, it matters that we're talking about British rebels. It matters that we're talking about someone, Thomas Jefferson, who understood intellectually that slavery was not an institution that he should participate in, but morally participated in it, because we get to Kenneth Clark, who talks about the Dr. Kenneth Clark, who writes The Dark Ghetto, but who is famous because of him and his wife, Dr. Mammy and Kenneth Clark, who did the doll test, in which black people thought that they were inferior to white people, is that the psychological onslaught that I get from Joshua Bennett, the constant saying that you have not contributed to America, comes to Langston Hughes, I'm jumping in time, becomes to Langston Hughes, I too am America. So what happens with two parties, it started really with the white ethnic group, but we grew away from the white ethnic group. The white ethnic immigrant group that we started with, that helped also build America. Because when you want to say immigrants build America, let's not forget the white ethnic group, even though they forgot themselves. Brooklyn was once Jewish. Part of the immigrants is still there. That diaspora is still there. Brooklyn was also once Italian. Brooklyn's now had its black phase, just like DC. Now Brooklyn is going through its white phase again. These areas have their narratives. These spaces have their narratives. And what happens is that because people want to see that they have made it, that they have some quote unquote success, they're willing to forego the negative part, or what Dr. Kenneth Clark calls the moral schizophrenia of America. They won't see what it takes for Americans to have that American dream. Before we even get to the American dream, you got to see how sick the Manifest Destiny was. To land on one part of a continent and say, you know what? I can't see the other part, but I will kill everybody until I can. Texas, Mexico, California.
It's funny that you say that.
Mexico. No, this is our shit now. This is America's. That's how America is. And once you understand that psychology, you gotta go like, holy fuck on, you want the universe. And America is like, yes.
Yeah. And we're gonna touch on that when we get to the imperialism from the Gilded Age for everybody to see. Again, Gilded Age, everybody should go check it out. I'm sure it's multiple versions, as most books have multiple versions.
You have to.
But what I'll say to that is, man, no, I agree 100% in terms of the idea that we forget, and why I'm always talking about deconstructing race, in the sense that we have to get back to just respecting the lineage and identity of people as a whole. But I do understand that people like to play within race because it allows you to conflate and expand on command, as you have a person, quote unquote. Like the whole reason it sparked this conversation was the DNC convention, and people again talking about how immigrants built America. And you have a person like Joe Biden, who quote unquote is Irish, of Irish descent, who passes as white, as Anglo-American. Because nobody ever really, like you said, people forget that and don't necessarily.
So like the conversation around the Kennedys, because the Kennedys happened, Joe can happen.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
And so what happens is nobody really ever has that conversation. Of course, we had the diasporic conversations around blackness, because in a quote unquote racist, oppressive structure that America is, and them being the majority, we don't. It becomes a conversation of, well, what group of quote unquote colored people are the best model, and
that is true.
Who can we prop up to become the quote unquote standard, as they understand that whiteness alone, creates a harsh view, in the sense that people looking up to whiteness wouldn't necessarily, they would have apprehensions as it's more brash in the sense that I'm not, in America right now, I'm not necessarily trying to hear what old white men got to talk about and so on and so forth, right? That whiteness needs a buffer. Whiteness has to have a buffer to maintain itself in America because America has been what it is for so long, right? And so we're now at the point of them allowing and creating a narrative in
this
this
audience, right? What you're talking about is how whiteness needs a buffer, the same way the German royals who call themselves the British family needs a buffer.
It all happens across different nations. I'm not super well versed in that dichotomy.
I'm just talking about the royal family in England.
No, because they need a buffer as well. That's why that whole Meghan Markle shit was stupid.
Yeah, man, it's funny. They need a buffer. I get what you're saying. They have to innovate.
They have to innovate and they have to indoctrinate. And so what happens is now we get into this point where the conversation is immigrants have built America. And not in a very genuine way of where we conquered the Native Americans first. We just slaughtered them. And then we enslaved this population from Africa who, again, full transparency, sold their people into this situation, and we then exploited their labor. But now we're having this conversation of quote unquote, which is going to bring us into the next segment, kind of, and not even segment, but the next article in terms of when we talk about hot cellar, and hot cellar being where we see the influx of demographics where we are able to even have this conversation in America now, 21st century, where we're talking about immigrants building America, right? And that being Black immigrants, whether you are from Caribbean, whether you are from continental Africa, whether you are from Britain, and so on and so forth, right? So to pull it up, nope, that's not it, people. Here we are. Immigration of Nationality Act of 1965. And I'll just read the top just to give you an idea what the bill is. So on this day, in a ceremony at the base of a Statue of Liberty, President LBJ signed into law Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, commonly known as the Hot Cellar Act, after its main two sponsors, Senator Philip A. Hart of Michigan and Representative Emanuel Sulla of New York. The law overhauled America's immigration system during a period of deep global instability. For decades, the federal quota system has severely restricted the number of people from outside of Western Europe, so that's speaking to our white ethnic people, eligible to settle in the United States. I'm going to skip down a little bit for y'all. And it says the law capped the number of annual visas at 290,000, which included a restriction of 20,000 visas per country per year. Policymakers had vastly underestimated the number of immigrants who would take advantage of the family reunification clause. In particular, the law created new opportunities for immigrants from Asian nations to join relatives in America following hot cellar. Annual immigration jumped to nearly 500,000 people, and only 20% came from Europe. And so before I bring you into the conversation, we have here my our housemate, Quan the Poet, who is or I believe is second generation?
Yeah.
Second generation. And so what I would like for you to do is just kind of give me a idea of what it is you've been dealt in terms of, you have the dichotomy of being identifying with quote unquote African American as well as your immigrant background, but just how you kind of interface with that.
Okay, so just a bit of backstory. So my mom came in the late 70s. She's originally from Kingston, Jamaica. So she came through through a family visa because the majority of my family was already in Connecticut. So she came in around her teenage years and lived most of her teenage to adult young life in Bridgeport, Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
She then came down to DC in her mid 20s, had my sister in the 80s, early 80s, had me in the late 80s, 88 to be exact. So one of the things that growing up with that in mind was that we didn't necessarily treat Black people differently in our interactions, but I was raised differently to value different things. So like I was taught to not necessarily value some of the things that Black Americans would value. So I would come off as different.
But let me, because I know we had this. I'm not cutting you off.
Okay.
I am. But the reason I'm cutting you off is because I feel like you're selling us short. And what I mean by that is like, what was some of those things that you were talking about?
Okay, so for example, because of my immigrant background, from my mom, of course, when it came to wanting certain things that my friends would get, such as shoes, such as, clothes and all of those things, a lot of the time, the conversations would come down to, you should be happy that you have clothes. You should be happy that you got running water. You should be happy that, it would come down to those types of things as literal reasons. Because every time I would compare like what's going on in my community through my eyes as a child and what I would want, it would be compared to third world.
Gotcha.
And because I was young, I didn't understand. I just rolled with it. It's like, okay, well, shoot, I should be happy that I got running water, and I should be happy I don't have cardboard for shoes, and go through, because in her part of Jamaica, Kingston, during those times, when you look back, it's nothing but the violence and like rebels coming in, and like those are real stories that was had. And when I would compare those stories to what was going on outside, it would literally be like, yeah, I guess I should be grateful that I don't have cardboard for shoes, so I shouldn't want none of those things. So like, even though my friends had all of those things, and when it came to me, I just came off as different because I didn't value it.
So let me ask you this. Was there ever a point in terms of your upbringing where those values and those standards made you look down? And for full transparency, me and you have went to like school together.
Yeah.
So was there ever a time where, because I love fashion and everything like that, or was there ever a time like where this person's is out of place, or have you ever felt like you looked down on Black Americans, or have you ever felt like the outside cultures that kind of look into the African American space, or what it is that, like, quote unquote, I am in terms of what people would consider pop culture?
Yeah.
Do you have a disdain, or was there ever a disdain in terms of like, that's ignorant without the understanding of where I come from? Like, knowing me now and having grown to know me, was there ever a disconnect in understanding the full story of what not only my mother, but my grandmother and her mother went through to bring us or bring me to this point, versus where your mother is planted in a situation where we've already suffered the traumas and fought through that.
Yeah, so I'll speak on that candidly. So someone being an immigrant is knowing that you're just inherently being taught to take advantage. So a lot of the times when you're in situations like, let's take school for example, you just taught to like just take advantage of everything because all you know from your parents is what was never in place. So when you in school, you take advantage of it. You know, sometimes in school, it's not so much of you knowing what you know, but sometimes you just want to fit in so that you don't fuck up the curve. You know what I mean? You don't want to be the nail that sticks out from the group.
I love that. I'm glad you said that.
You don't want to be the nail that sticks out from the group. But me not knowing shit and me just being, you know, this is what I'm doing. I'm taking advantage of what's mine. You just naturally like, all right, I know what's going on. I'm just going to say what the answer is and going about my day. But again, I would get chastised for it by my peers. And I really wouldn't understand until I look back and I really like engage with that and think like, wow, you know what I mean? It wasn't really necessarily about me being smart or me, you know, it was more so of me needing to take a step back and realize like, all right, you know shit, but in the class, everybody else is trying to, you know what I mean? You don't want to be the sore thumb to stick out and show everybody up as opposed to,
No, I didn't want to cut you off.
No,
I know, I want them to say it.
You say it.
Okay, because going back to our narrative, you know, we fought all the time. We got beatings for fighting.
At that bar in the basement.
We got beatings for fighting. But it goes back because I can relate to what he's talking about.
Hey, Slim, hold on. Yeah. Can you hold that thought?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, we used to get our ass beat. Hey, yo, I used to be like, oh, motherfucker stand on the bar. Like,
why I gotta do this? And then you got the cousins and sisters shit upstairs laughing at us. They're laughing at us and shit. They think it's funny. But no. That's what my mother taught me. She's a boomer. She talks about hand-me-downs. She talks about how life ain't about fun, it's about survival. I've had the scene where she literally shows you her pay stub and it's like, we can't have this because look at this tax line. Look at that tax line. Look at this tax line. You want to have a house or you want to have a car. You have those very real financial conversations about what it takes to be owners. When it's possible for you to be an owner, and that's what most Black Americans aspire to, it may seem like, oh, I'm looking down on you like, nigga, you ain't nothing. You know, I went to the same nigga schools until what, Tech? Until Tech. I went to...
Because Winston was a nigga school.
It was a nigga school.
Hines at the time was like quasi. Hines was like quasi at the time. Because Hines was like a lower step between Jeff.
Bro.
In comparison to Hart.
Bro. Yeah. I done had a blade pulled on me at Hines. I done literally seen blood.
Them Southwest niggas.
Not even just Potomac God niggas, son.
Southwest.
Potomac God niggas.
So they used to think us go to
I'm not stupid. Okay, y'all went through the trenches.
No, I got you.
I just remember seeing blood. This is why the LGBTQIA plus community, I don't even know, if you're from DC at a certain area, like, somebody coming out saying I'm gay is like, okay, whatever, nigga, so move on. I'm at the point, like, move on. Like, it's not, no, we need to acknowledge that there are a lot of Black American men who don't want to acknowledge that they are homophobic because they are radicalized and like pleasure.
But most of us are.
But most of us is like, all right, cool, whatever, bro.
I'm still fucking pussy, but you do.
You do you. And more importantly, I don't care. But there was a dude who tried another dude because he was gay. And he had him leaking from the gym all the way to the main office. And I mean fresh red cherry blood. So don't fight somebody because you think they're a chump. But that's the point. Because I use this language and I use this diction and I'm able to do the things I do. People try me and they don't think I'm from that environment. So what happens is that you don't trust me on the other side of the institutions that I understand and have your best interests at heart. So you know I'm speaking on facts when I say I've been screamed at in public meetings when I had the levers to pull to help folks. And I'm like, I can't tell you because I swore an oath what it is that you need to do. I need you to comprehend what situation you're in so I can help you on the other side. But they don't want to hear that. And that's when it comes down to the professionalism that's rejected or the brain drain, the diminishing of social capital that a lot of people see Black Americans do. Is what I mean by that is that your thug and your professional need to be at the same dinner table. Because that's what politicians do. That's what the Japanese do. You don't see anybody mad because they're Yakuza or they tried.
And definitely bring both of those.
But Killer Mike talks about that all the time. Killer Mike talks about how people talk about their criminal element of their life as well as a legitimate element and how complex commerce and trade and dealing with human emotions and capital really is. So that's why I can relate to what he's talking about when it comes down to you are told take advantage because you have to also know what's at risk. Because I'm above a certain income, so I don't get those public benefits or that public benefit of doubt. But I'm also not white, so I can't afford white life. So I'm in this quasi zone. Go ahead.
And just to wrap up, one of the other biggest things too is that growing up, as far as having like an immigrant parent, you never wanted to bring shame on the family. I dare not ever brought shame upon my mom or because for immigrants, it's like family is all you have. And to bring shame upon that or to have one of them come down on you when that is the only frame of reference that you have, it's like hell on earth. If you come home and you haven't accomplished or achieved or, you know what I mean, did what you were supposed to do. So that was a whole nother aspect. And I feel like that's across the board with a lot of immigrants. It's like the worst thing you can do is bring shame upon your family because they're dependent on you to be something.
And with that being said, the question that I have for you is because I've seen in media publications, whether it be around Kamala Harris or other people, have you personally speak to, in terms of that shame, is that shame ever shared with associating with quote unquote African Americans in an intimate manner? And when I say intimate, not just sexually or quote unquote, I'm dating another person, but in the sense that quote unquote, we pair with each other in terms of a business endeavor or having likened yourself to our culture, which is seen as a degenerate culture abroad.
So if I understand, let me try to understand what you're asking. So like, are you saying like in terms of relationship with like Black Americans, do we like shame
the culture? So
guilt by association.
Yeah. You being in camera or doing and going on endeavors with me, whether it be business or whether you pairing yourself with an African American woman, as I know is more prevalent in the Asian community, as I've seen people get completely ousted by pairing themselves with African American women, quote unquote. Have you ever experienced that, or is that a conversation amongst Black immigrants who share our phenotype? Because Asian Americans are different in the sense that they quote unquote pass or have the ability to pass as quote unquote white, and use that different social capital in that way. But as a person who kind of looks like us, is that same level of shame also there when it comes to African Americans?
I got you now. Okay, so all right, I'm gonna get a little into. Okay, so a lot of the times what happens is that it shapes who you decide to, you know what I mean, be intimate with. Because again, you cannot just go and sort of mingle and date with who you want to, because you'll be told straight up, no, not them, not her. You know what I mean? So again, it's funny because you don't get taught how to like treat people in public, but in private, those conversations are always had as far as what your standard is. And it's like literally, we could be in a car and it'll be like, nope, not her, not that. It's just inherent.
And it comes from a respectability lens. It comes into, again, seeing black as poor, seeing black as nefarious. Because if I'm hearing you both correctly, it's like the guilt by association. This is because you're dealing with an inner city black person, because this is where my life becomes super weird. Because I'm an inner city black boy who can kind of articulate from what people call street knowledge, you know, I hate that. Called street knowledge and institutional knowledge, they believe that I'm a rare specimen. And I mean the word specimen. There's anomalies and outliers that are treated like specimens and wanting to answer the Negro question. But what I mean by that is that are asking that amongst the black diaspora, there are prejudice and biases against the Black American.
Mm-hmm.
And are you confirming that there are prejudice and biases amongst the diaspora about Black Americans?
Oh yes, okay. Yes. There's a lot of them.
So then my question becomes, where if the origin of the prejudice and the biases are not rooted in white supremacy, are the prejudice and biases against Black Americans amongst the Black Americans, are the prejudice and biases of Black Americans that are not rooted in white supremacy, are they rooted in ideas from white supremacy, or is it a notion that because Black Americans have not achieved as greatly as white Americans, they are inferior to white Americans in their acumen to proceed or advance economically in America?
Okay, so just to speak on that a bit, I believe that a lot of, and this is just growing up, a lot of what immigrants tend to learn about Black America is straight from the TV. So our introduction to Black America is through media.
Gotcha.
So
I've heard that multiple times.
All you tend to see is what looks like success and what doesn't look like success.
So what's missing is the actual conversation about Black Americans. That's cool.
And if all you have to go on is through Black media, that tends to shape like, okay, this is how I should be, and this is how I don't want to be, and what I should avoid.
Got you.
You know what I'm saying? So when those things play out, sometimes it can be intentional, but a lot of times it plays out of survival, because you have to sort of choose one, because you have no real footing within society until you choose one. And unfortunately, you're choosing one over the other, not realizing that there's nuance in between. And that's what I had to learn on my own. Because again, a lot of the times people come from just third world. Gotcha. And third world is like,
Absolute poverty.
Exactly. So when you come from third world and you see two dynamics, one being perceived as good and one being perceived as bad, you'll do anything to survive. You'll be grateful for running water when you don't have to go to the well that's miles away in order to get water if it's fresh. You know what I'm saying? You would appreciate socks, shoes, clothing, fresh food. You know, those things are things that, you know, you learn to appreciate. So when you being told these stories and you happen to look outside and you see people that, you know what I mean? Because you don't know that that Black Americans deserve more. You don't know that until you get to interact. So all you see, because what you're being told is your side, which is third world, all you see is man, running water.
They tricking off the resources.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
That's what I hear.
Yeah.
They're playing with the bag.
You hear these stories about what you don't have, shoes on your feet. You know, these are resources.
Gotcha.
And you feel like it's not being taken advantage. The library. All of these things are like things that an immigrant looks at and it's like Candyland. Not knowing it's the projects. But to them, the projects is like epic.
Step up.
It's a jump from absolute poverty into
so
relative.
Before we get into the last segment, do you got any comments from our beautiful friends, beautiful people over there on the YouTube, Facebook, Twitterverse?
All right, so I wanted to make sure that I got this question from IceX96. She said that both speakers seem very educated and have a detailed understanding of the history of Black America. Do they feel that their vision for the future of Black America is equally detailed and vivid? And she's still in the chat, so if you want to
go respond first, please.
I answer yes, in the sense that it's vivid in a way that I don't necessarily want us to be confined to assimilation. And I mean that for the whole diaspora and not just Black Americans. But I understand that in America, what happens is you are, despite your race, put into this dichotomy of whether you're going to model white behavior or quote unquote what they would consider degeneracy. And that degeneracy, as you just mentioned, is born out of a curation of centuries, right? And so the outward looking vision that I have for us is that when we produce content, whether it be from an entertainer aspect, is that, you know, Asian Americans have their own media or have their own narratives when they are talking, or Nigerian Americans have their own narrative. And we don't have a Daniel Kaluuya having to play a quote unquote Black Panther and Fred Hampton, while also, again, because I understood what he was saying when he was saying the thing about not wanting to walk in the line of race with everything. But I need him to understand is that when you come to America, that's what America is. It's the belly of race. It's the inception of race. It's the creation of race. It's where race was invented. So you have, and you can't move around it. I want to be free of race. I want to be free from being a nigga. I don't want to live and have to do this day in, day out as a job. I don't want to make this a hustle. I don't want to make this a thing. I want to get on and do stuff in fashion and be big and be great in my own separate way. But I understand that I can't do that without, one, freeing everybody from the confines and constructs of race, and that means Black ethnics as well as white ethnics. And everybody has to get on board right now. Because right now we are at a pivot in America. We are at a pivot. And Joe Biden, bless his heart, if he wins, we need to critique him because we need to understand that you are against reparations, but you are Irish American. You are not an Anglo American. You are not, quote unquote, white in the traditional sense of what America is. So that vivid imagination and that vivid landscape of what I want for Black America extends to all Americans. But what I know is that the immigrants, whether they be Black or white, are brought here to undermine labor, are brought here to undermine and further create a buffer within the confines and constructs of race for America to, quote unquote, uphold and create this narrative that they are inclusive when they are very much not any of that. They are not inclusive. So if you are abroad watching this, understand that this country is not inclusive in any way, shape, form, or to imagine, because even their white counterparts are not allowed to be ideological diverse, or they also will be casted out. Or do you want to talk to Bernie Sanders, a man who doesn't have the gumption to sit on TV and talk about how he didn't want to run against Joe Biden and actually secure the nomination in a COVID America when we have our current nominee talking about actually vetoing Medicare for all? Because he didn't, Bernie Sanders want to be Ralph Nader or be outcasted. It is bigger than Black and white, but it's about Black and white. Because until we acknowledge that it's about Black and white, we can't get past Black and white.
I'll jump on there.
Go ahead, please.
I'll jump in there because I thought, wow, I got into too political. It's like, I don't care about politics. And this is why. Politicians have to learn this one thing. Politics, politicos, means the affairs of the city. You serve me. I do not serve you. That is what it means to be American. It means that I look you in your face and say, isn't that because you have a better acumen or understanding of life than me? It's because you have decided to make the decision. Whereas I have decided to put my effort elsewhere. And to answer your question directly, my vision for America dovetails yours and the passion that you bring for it, in the sense of the vividness is in what you bring. Anyone in this room who knows me, anyone who's watching it who knows me, I shine best in a room full of interesting people, full of interesting conversation, because I thrive on conversation. The reason I drink on the show is not just because I like to have a drink, it's also because I invite people to partake in the conversation while enjoying themselves. Because it's important for us to understand the power of being a citizen and the weight of being a neighbor, of having the trust of someone calling you a neighbor, of having the intimacy of someone calling you a friend, so that when we grow to communities, when someone like a Joe Biden comes in, or Kamala Harris, or a Mike Pence, or a Donald Trump, we ask them as a community, what do you have for us? You know that you have our vote if you have our interest. And in my understanding of what it takes to get to that point in which the conversation you're having about Bernie Sanders, the Medicare for all, and how things are being lost because we're lost in the conversation and want to subvert or circumvent the conversation about Black and white, instead of having a conversation about this is why Black and white exists and this is why we need to teach why Black and white exists. But more importantly, we also need to teach the values and the histories of Black, white, and others who come to America. And going back to our theme, if we acknowledge that America was built by immigrants, then we must acknowledge that America also has diasporic narratives. So if every little Black American child knows how they contribute to America, they will also have the value in within their mind, and in my quixotic and in my perfect dream, every little Black American child and every little Black child across the diaspora, as every child will see that the history that they inherit, so that they can begin to understand how they can contribute to change and redress things within their time, so that we can have basically, how I believe, more fun by tackling the things that we cannot handle, which is COVID and the things that nature throws at us. So that's my dream of Black America.
And so with that being said, we're going to end on this note, and, everybody can get their final thoughts. And this just goes back to what we were talking about. And it says, along with the abuse of, and this is from Gilded Sages. I mean, not Gilded Sages. The Gilded Age.
Boom. He just loves it that much.
And so, along with the abuse of African Americans in the South and the urban North, because the North be trying to run away, boy, from that work. Cause y'all are some, and y'all some nigga haters too. Stop it. Ooh. But the war against the displacement of Native Americans in the West are tragic and shameful aspects too often glossed over in discussions of the Gilded Age, which typically focus on conflicts between labor and capital. In fact, the injustices committed against African Americans, Native Americans, farmers, and labor were all intimately related to the economic growth that drove the Gilded Age. Again, this is 1870 to 1900. It was this explosive growth. Right? That contributed to the rise of American imperialism. So, with that being said, and we talk about, you mentioned it earlier, and I heard it, I caught it, it was on the tip of my tongue. You talk about how America goes into these different nations, to these different places, and we stage coups, and we corrupt the politicians of other nations. Mm-hmm. When we talk about our imperialistic endeavors of America, right? Mm-hmm. How it was funded and all of those different things. What I want to tell and what I want to say to the immigrant community, whether you're in here American or you're abroad, understand that our bodies are the fuel for America as an institution to go in, create and manufacture disaster, to pillage your most valuable, capable, educated citizens. Because we love in America talking about, Joe Biden mentioned it in his speech, we love talking about how we are great at taking the best of the best from all across the world. But we never talk about how we make that happen. We never talk about how that thing happens and how we get into that space. But I think it's worth it if you want to add to any of that to kind of, just end the conversation in terms of, this not being a conversation about Black Americans versus whatever. Mm-hmm. This is about us trying to really build and get people to understand that we're all being used in this situation and environment. And then you can offer any last words that you like. I said what I said. I don't really have too much on it. We've covered it for the most part in terms of how the Jewish became white, the Irish became white, Black immigrants as well. And you can go ahead.
Yeah, and so basically how it is that America is an institution building country. So it's not a country that is definite, meaning that yes, whiteness needs to be acknowledged. Blackness needs to be acknowledged. But in that, we have to also acknowledge the identities that were lost, erased, and the different stories, especially when you get into how colorism plays into the ability to pass, not to pass, how colorism plays out in the Caribbean when you have the Haitian and Dominicans, and how that plays inside of different families, and how you have a lot of Afro-Mexicans that are ignored. We have to pay attention to colorism as well. And so when we talk about America, we have to talk about a philosophical country that basically is faceless in its promise. America is not only faceless in its promise, it also extends its promise to the world, especially when you get into the Truman Doctrine about democracy and how people can lead nations better than they can lead anything else. And so that's where it becomes important with Americans to understand is that why are we saying Nigerian American instead of saying American Nigerian? Why are we saying white American instead of saying American white? Is that in America, what's supposed to be important is that your allegiance to America. But when we have and you use the framework in which Audre Lorde, I love Audre Lorde, when Audre Lorde comes in and starts to talk about how you cannot dismantle the masses' tools with the masses' house. And my thing is, you know me, I like to be subversive. If the masses' house is so goddamn great, turn it into a community center. Meaning that, and we can see in environmentalism, if it takes this much exploitation of people and of natural resources for people to feel like that they are great within the Anglo-American imagination, capitalism, then we have to reframe our ideas of what success is. Because success is not only killing the people that we like to label others, it's also killing the planet and the future generations of those who think they are the leaders. So that's where I would end, is saying that the arrogance of sexism and racism kills us and those who are yet to be.
And with that said, my beautiful, beautiful supporters, I appreciate y'all for coming out. We appreciate y'all for tuning in to watch the video. We appreciate y'all for engaging the conversation. We're going to come back again here next week. We may drop some content in the middle of the week. Please subscribe so that you can jump in any specific conversation. We love to have y'all. Thank y'all to everybody who chimed in. Appreciate it. Bring more people into the Sage community, man.
Email us, please.
Please
email us.
And I'm working on definitely trying to get these surveys and docs together so that I can better engage y'all as a community, so that I can have y'all input. But definitely, if you can, hit that like button, hit that share button. Please leave a comment. It is what it is. This is 2020. So again, we love y'all, man. We appreciate y'all. And until next time, this is Gilded Sages. I got my housemates here, InquisitiveQ. Check out his IG. And my man Quan, the poet who stepped out. Check out his IG. Mine, TheeBlackAngloSaxon. And we all different in our different ways. His is heavy words, heavy topics. You know, my man Quan, he a writer as well. I'm more of a visual person. I do the fashion, you know, but definitely check us out. Get us on our personal tips, the interface with us in a more personal way. But we, again, appreciate y'all for coming out on this Saturday night. Y'all enjoy. Y'all be safe. And we love y'all. Thank you.